Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's Chief Tech Correspondent. I want to welcome you all here to this wonderful webinar arranged by the German Marshall Fund entitled Setting the Agenda for a Transatlantic Digital Alliance. We have a really good panel today lined up for this hour conversation. I'll also hopefully take some of your questions during the event, so please make sure you put those forward. So who do we have? We have Tom Wheeler, who is the former chairman of the FCC. We have Thibaut Kleiner, Director for Policy, Strategy and Outreach at the European Commission's DG Connect. And last but not least, Karen Kornbluh, the Senior Fellow and Director of GMF Digital. And so we're here almost a week to go before the G7 summit kicks off here in the United Kingdom at the end of next week, followed very quickly by the first EU-US summit in Brussels, where Joe Biden is coming to town to discuss a variety of issues, not just digital. Before we get into some of the sort of discussions around resetting the transatlantic digital agenda, Karen, can I just turn to you first? We have a week to go before this sort of first sort of in-person meeting on a variety of topics, both digital and non-digital. Where do you see things right now in terms of resetting this digital transatlantic alliance?
First of all, thanks so much, Mark, for doing this. And thank you, Tom and Thibaut, for participating. I think this is a great scene setter for what's going to be a really eventful, I think, week next week. You know, the US and Europe have both been talking about the desire to work together on tech. And I think there's been this misconception in a lot of people's heads that this is some grand diplomatic game theory moment where people are going to trade off their own domestic interests in favor of the common threat against authoritarians, namely China. And I think instead, it's really the return of, at least in the US, a domestic policy lens, that Tom has written about, where we relook at the digital space and say, how can we update and have good policies, even in the US and globally? And then let's come together and figure out where the commonalities are. And a big example of that is all the movement that's been happening on tax, where the US Treasury has come forward, broken a logjam, put forward this minimum tax idea. Europe seems to be responding. The USTR said that they were going to hold off on their sanctions. The EU came back and said, yeah, we're looking at a broad digital tax agenda. We're not going to single out the big American companies. So there's a lot of progress. The other issues, just to forecast them, of course, we have AI, where the EU has put forward a really interesting proposal. And I think a lot of folks in the US who were ready to be opposed aren't as opposed as we thought they would be, despite Eric Schmidt coming out and having a lot of criticisms of it. The industry seems willing to work on it. On supply chains and cybersecurity, the US has a big interest in doing more to secure our supply chains, to make them less vulnerable to interruptions, especially after COVID, but also to against China if that becomes necessary. And Europe seems to be open to a lot of that. The US and Europe both putting a lot of money on the table to invest in their own innovation, semiconductors being a big part of the supply chain. Privacy Shield, I think, is a lot tougher. This is the issue about, can we have free flow of data across the Atlantic? And there we're sort of stuck where the policy can't quite work because the European Court of Justice has weighed in and the policymakers are a little bit frozen. You have to address what the European Court of Justice has said is a problem for Europe in the US space. Are we going to be able to get past that? We had an article yesterday, I think, if not today, by 3 major US surveillance experts saying for the US's benefit, they weren't even talking about Europe, we need to have more transparency and accountability in the surveillance space. So again, I think domestic policy relooking at this framework is going to help move the transatlantic piece. I think that's sort of the overview of the big issues. Is that what you're looking for, Mark?
Yeah, you're speaking my language. Everything from tax to, we missed maybe antitrust competition policy, but I think
there you go.
everything else is there. Thibaut, I appreciate, I'm not going to ask you to speak for all of Brussels or the Commission, but from your perspective, there's a lot to cover here. And I would be maybe interested. I always think that you get the big policy stuff by doing some of the short-term success stories, short-term goals. I mean, from your perspective, where do you think in the very short term, even from June 15th around the summit over to say the end of the year, where do you think the US and Europe can sort of work on specific goals, digital goals?
First of all, many thanks for the invite, and I think for organizing this event today. I think it's very timely, and I should say that in Brussels, there is currently lots of excitement about these various meetings. Really, because people are simply rejoicing to find somehow old friends that are ready to engage and that have maybe an agenda that is a little more positive towards common goals, and also that have different ways of reaching out. So I think that by and large, there is a lot of appetite, I think, a lot of readiness. And my contacts with the U.S. administration in the past month show as well that there is, I think, on both sides really mutual interest in terms of how we can solve similar puzzles we have, especially in the tech landscape. So I would just flag that at this stage is very much like we need to zoom in some priorities in terms of where we can do work together, because if you look at the potential list of topics where US engagement with Europe makes sense, it's a very, very long list, basically. So I think that if you look at issues from climate change to global value chains, and the situation we are facing on both sides of the Atlantic currently, that there are, for instance, semiconductor shortages, or even that we need to secure vaccine supply chains in the current COVID situation. All this, I think, goes together with the idea that we need to also upgrade somehow the way we look at global developments around, for instance, Russia and China, and how they have been also expanding somehow their influence in various areas of the globe, and how together I think we can work on the common tech agenda as regards, for instance, standardization, or how we go about, internet platforms, for instance, that I think on both sides of the Atlantic, we see a very common understanding of the puzzles and the issues. And I think now is the time to think about how we can join forces in providing solutions to this long list of common items we have. So I think that's very much the agenda setting, I would say, in the short term that I see as the first priority, and trying maybe to put in place some of the delivery instruments. I mean, there is a lot of discussion about this potential trade and technology council. I mean, as such, it is not an answer, but it may be an interesting vehicle to simply make sure that both sides go quicker in terms of finding this mutual solution.
Tom, the joys of going last is you have to respond to everybody. So I might focus specifically on Thibaut's point about, okay, the reset has happened. We need to work with each other. What if you were sort of sitting inside the administration, what would you want to focus on? Is it a question of the sort of the more sort of woolly things around ethics and sort of values, although very important? Is it about hardcore national security? Where would you focus your time?
So I think that Karen and Thibaut have done a terrific job laying out the scope of what we're talking about here. But let's begin by celebrating the return of multilateralism, right? I mean, here we are. We have an American administration that says yes. As the president said, America is back. We want to engage internationally. Okay, that's a huge step forward. And the question now becomes, all right, how do you pull that off? And we ought not to have unrealistic expectations for what happens this month in both of those forums. that we ought to view it as the beginning of a process, not the answers to a process. Hopefully, in the tech area, it's the beginning of some serious ministerial negotiations. But even that is challenged. You know, we need focus, focus, focus. There are so many areas, and Karen and Thibaut have just laid them out. And we can't boil the ocean on this. We need to set a prioritization of the issues that are going to be accomplished. Everybody has something on the list that they want resolved, but we can't do them all simultaneously. I ran across a quote the other day from Van Gogh, since we're doing a transatlantic activity here, where he said that great things are done by a series of small things brought together. And so what we need to be doing is, yes, we've begun the discussion. Yes, we need to move into specific negotiations, but let's focus on a handful of things rather than, as I say, boiling the ocean. But let's also remember that all alliances are local, right? Tip O'Neill used to say all politics are local. All alliances are local as well. You know, we have seen in the last week in the statement by France, Germany, and the Netherlands that a trans-European coming together is challenging. And we have seen in the United States a frankly dysfunctional Congress that can't figure out where we stand, and the limitations of ex post actions in the digital marketplace. And so we ought to be realistic that we haven't got our act together on either side of the Atlantic. And that is the sine qua non to moving ahead transatlantically.
I don't want to agree with you because that would be quite boring. So I'm going to be the sort of antagonistic journalist and maybe throw a few spanners in the works and say the US and Europe, for me, are speaking two different languages. Right? And not just because, you know, we all speak some version of English, but because the US is coming at this discussion around national security, China, and that type of thing that focuses on supply chain, logistics, that sort of thing, pushback against Huawei. Whereas the Europeans, purely because their digital policy is further advanced than the American side, they are focusing more on platform regimes, antitrust rules, things that, unfortunately, because of what Tom said, aren't going to happen in Congress anytime soon. So to all three of you, how do you square that circle where everyone wants to do a deal and work together, but the end game is very different, from my perspective, from Washington versus Brussels? Maybe Karen could start with you.
Yeah, great question. And I think it's actually, although you phrased it nicely as contradicting Tom, I think it's really consistent with what Tom was saying. And my sense is that the issues we've already talked about were sort of the thorny issues that have been, you know, plaguing us all for a long time: the tax, the privacy, et cetera. And we need to defang those. Wrong word. I shouldn't use the word fang, but we need to clear out the underbrush, you know, and at least move those towards resolution, because especially the tax issue, was nearing crisis. And when you're taxing my French wine, I call that a crisis. But that's table stakes. Then we have to get to these thornier issues that are more current, that are also zero sum, like the platform work, like the antitrust work. I think on the platform work, there's more openness for compromise than it appears. It's true that Europe is thinking in a regulatory way that is very different than where the US is. The US is still arguing over Section 230 and whether, we should just sue platforms. Europe is already thinking of a whole new risk-based regime, very, very different. But there's interest, obviously, huge interest in the US in doing something about disinformation, huge interest in addressing conspiracy theories and so on. And there are a lot of things that the administration can do through its executive and its independent agencies. Tom can talk more about that, as well as things that we could do on a multilateral basis, building off of what Europe is doing. Let's say, for instance, the Code of Conduct, which, although Europe has put out this Digital Services Act, that's not going to happen for years. The Democracy Action Plan and its Code of Conduct are going to happen much sooner. And if the platforms are agreeing to a bunch of stuff in Europe, surely if the US is interested, it can leverage some of that stuff. I think on the DMA, it's a lot harder, but it's also going to be handled by antitrust competition experts. So I'm not sure we have to hammer it out among the two of us. My sense is that people will put things off, beg for time. And I just want to hint at the third. So there's the stuff that's been plaguing us. There's the stuff that's right on the front burner, that's hot, that's zero sum. And then I think there's the next stuff. You use the words values and vision. I think once we get rid of the really thorny stuff that's been plaguing us, we need to figure out a roadmap to deal with some of the big existential challenges that have been facing us. Climate being, of course, number one. The pandemic is on there as number two. I would also put disinformation there. What's our longer term game to show that democracies work, as Joe Biden has been saying? And I think if we can get people excited and get them looking forward to some values, which we can't do until we get rid of the really, old stuff. I think if we can start people working towards some bigger end games, maybe we can create some more political capital to do some of the stuff we need to do.
Can I dive in there for just a second? I agree with Karen in all but her ranking. It seems to me that it is the existential crises that are driving the day and should be driving the day right now. I mean, stop and think about it. I think in the United States, at least, we have 5 existential crises, and that needs to be the focus of our government. Of course, we've got the pandemic. We've got the economy that results from that. We've got climate change. We've got social justice. And we've got the 5th, which may be unique to us, which is that for the last 4 years, the structures of government that could do something about the previous 4 have been hollowed out. And those are the priorities that our national government needs to be focusing on. And as much as we all are tech nerds or tech wonks and think that the whole world revolves around digital policy, there are other more pressing issues, both domestically and internationally. And the relevant question, therefore, becomes, where is it that tech policy can address the existential issues first? Then we go on to the other issues like marketplace, supply chain, et cetera. But the real politic of where we exist right now is that we're staring multiple existential crises in the face on both sides of the Atlantic, and digital isn't an existential crisis per se, but it needs to play a role in addressing the real existential crisis.
If I can build on this, because I would challenge a little bit, Mark, where you're coming from in terms of portraying the differences between the EU and the US. I think there is a bit of a caricature sometimes that Europe is all about regulating tech, but not really doing it. Whereas in the US, they have already the technology in place, and therefore the regulation is not that important, or only at the fringe. I think this is a little bit of an exaggeration, if I may say. I think, in fact, we also have technological leaders in the EU, excellent research activities, even though we are not as advanced in some areas. And actually, if you look at, for instance, artificial intelligence, I mean, the proposal that was made a few weeks ago, everybody jumped on the regulation on some elements of artificial intelligence, but they forgot that there was in parallel, you know, a second proposal to develop excellence in terms of, you know, deploying these activities across the EU. So in fact, my impression is that we have different models, possibly different governance on both sides of the Atlantic, and also different interests. I think this is not disappearing. I think that you know, the way these trade discussions are taking place is very real. You know, and there are different you know, interests. We should not deny it. But what I think is very interesting these days is that there is a level of maturity in this transatlantic relation, which is really at an interesting point, you know, where both sides, I think, can look eye to eye, recognize common interests, and work together on solving the problem. And I would very much subscribe to what Tom was saying earlier, that we have a long list. That's also what I was also trying to say. And we need now to focus on what we can deliver in the coming month, because I think if the situation in the US is correct, from what I understand, I mean, we may have a window of bipartisanship that may not last forever. So we need really to make the best out of it, to join forces on concrete issues, from, you know, indeed data flows to platform, to also value chain. And I think this is something I would underline. To me, value chain is one area where there is industrial possibility to work together.
So I think that Thibaut makes a really good point. I literally wrote down level of maturity because I think it is on both sides. It is important, and I think I'm happy to say that for a change, after the last 4 years, we're approaching this issue in the United States government from a level of maturity, and Thibaut and his colleagues represent a level of maturity. I think that maturity, once we get to the marketplace issues, we get past the existential issues, we get to the marketplace issues, I think that level of maturity begins with a recognition that Europe has a head start. You know, Thibaut and his colleagues have been thinking more and acting more on the marketplace issues of protecting consumers and protecting competition and protecting the truth than we have been doing in the United States. And that in an interconnected world, there is a first mover advantage, and a mature recognition of that in the United States would be that there are consequences to not having established US policy, and that is the fact that somebody else gets to take the lead. You know, the tech companies in the United States have been incredibly successful in lobbying against any activity in the US government. And this is my day to be quoting Europeans, it seems, but one of my favorite other quotes is an old Oscar Wilde quote in which he said that there are two great tragedies in life: not getting what you want and getting it. And the reality is that the American companies in the American political system have gotten what they want, which is nothing. And that opens the door then to somebody else making the rules. See GDPR, which, you know, GDPR is not the be all and the end all, but it is the baseline for everything that gets done. When California wants to talk about privacy, they begin with GDPR. The only comment that I would make in terms of the need for maturity on the other side of the pond is that I agree with Thibaut and the kind of goals that he's setting out, but my comment to our friends over there would be, don't blow your leadership by turning it into some kind of nuanced protectionism. The focus needs to be on protecting consumers and protecting competition. And don't help the anti-regulation forces in their effort to reframe things by giving them protectionism bloody shirts that they can wave.
Can I just step in there? And again, apologies for cutting out there. My internet connection from home is not the best. I get what you're saying there, Tom, but is there not a point of that would be a lot better to be said about please don't pass protectionist measures if the US had any measures to offer as an alternative? And when I talk to folk in Brussels, they are very eager, per Thibaut's comments, about doing deals and working with Americans on things. But then they also say, but we don't have federal privacy law to work with. We don't have a renewed competition policy to work with. It feels to me, and again, maybe I'm waving my European flag too much, that for this to really work, the US also needs to provide alternatives and solutions. But
I'm in waving the American flag, I'm saying there are consequences of not acting. And we need to be aware. This is, back to Oscar Wilde. We need to be aware that if we fail to step up to how are we going to establish new expectations in the digital marketplace, that somebody else will, and that the reality of interconnection means that those policies get on both sides. Let me just, one quick story. The last time, I believe, that the United States government sat down with its European allies to talk about tech policy was 2 weeks after we passed the net neutrality rules of the FCC, when John Salad, our general counsel, and I were in London meeting with all of the equivalents in the EU, helping them work on their open internet guidelines. Not so they would be identical, but so they would all be compatible. And one of the things I learned was, my goodness, the French idea of an open internet and the Dutch idea of an open internet were two different kinds of things, but it was possible to reach an accord in terms of how you could have compatible oversight, and that oversight could be compatible with what we had done in the United States. And then, of course, the Trump administration comes in, erases everything in the United States, takes steps backwards. And once again, okay, where are the rules now that are at least the European norm, and by default the international norm? They're not coming out of the United States. And we need to be sensitive to that fact.
Thibaut, to you, Margaret Vestager yesterday said that she was hopeful that the Tech and Trade Council would be announced during the summit. And again, I'm not asking you to sort of confirm or deny that, but I mean, what would sort of, from your perspective, what would that play into the sort of resetting the agenda? And then Karen, following up on that, what do you make of that concept? We've had similar trade and tech councils between the US and Europe before. They haven't really gone anywhere. So Thibaut, first to you, what would you like to see come from that idea?
I think it's an idea that has been around for a while now, and I think that we should not get stuck to just a name or a phrase or a template somehow. But I think that it would be really useful to have a proper place where we can dig down about issues, and it's a bit what we were saying, I think, since the beginning, that we have potentially now a long list, But if we want really to do business, and we don't have much time because we have pressing issues, we better have a very efficient way, not only to talk, but actually to deliver certain elements, be it on, indeed exchanging on what the EU has solved in terms of regulatory puzzles, or learning also from the US how they are going about to enhance some of the network deployment of 5G, for instance, where in Europe we have had very good plans, and I was myself involved in this, a few years back, and we are still stuck, in the initial phases. So I think we have tremendous things to exchange and discuss, and that's why something like the Trade and Technology Council would be a very good tool for delivery. And I think that's what also Executive Vice President Vestager has in mind. I mean, it's not about just a talk shop. It's about getting down to business.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, the way to make sure that it's not just a talk shop, because I think that's really important. People quickly lose interest in a talk shop, and we've had a lot of those before. I think there are two big problems that need to be addressed really thoughtfully, that can't be discussed necessarily through negotiations, and that need that kind of ongoing discussion. One is, we all have these national security concerns about the supply chain, but we haven't yet figured out a way to ensure that our actions on that front are consistent with WTO obligations. How do we talk about, when the Trump administration clamped down on a lot of Chinese technology, it did so without a lot of transparency, which made it look like protectionism. I think Europe felt that some of the US's actions on 5G might have been protectionist. How do we articulate those together, those national security concerns? What is the justification that countries need to give for blocking imports or exports that are consistent with the rules-based system that we've built up? I think that's a really big one. I think a second issue is, we haven't talked about this yet, both Europe and the US have committed billions and billions for investing in new digital technology. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, is talking about a $50 billion appropriation for the semiconductor industry. Europe has as part of the Next Generation Fund, 20% of those funds are supposed to be for the digital transition. How do we avoid the pitfalls of what we used to call industrial policy, where we're picking winners and losers? The population thinks it looks corrupt. They hate it when things fail. We invest in the wrong technologies. What are some principles we can learn from past experiences with funding innovation? And how can we do that together? Are there some joint things that we can invest in to secure a supply chain, to make sure we're innovating? And the crucial issue, I think that has to drive this, is job creation, is economic growth and inclusive job creation. I think that's causing this huge crisis on both sides of the Atlantic. And if we can figure out a way together to solve that, I think that's really huge. So if the Trade and Technology Council can start addressing some of those, and I should say that at GMF Digital, we're going to be working on trying to help set the table with some of that. And I also want to just say, Mark, if you'll let me, GMF is going to release its Transatlantic Trends Report on June 7th, where it polls people on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'll give you a little preview that 57% of respondents in the US and Europe said that transatlantic tech cooperation is an effective way to compete with China. So there's an openness on both sides of the Atlantic to doing this kind of thing.
Always good to get a GMF plug in the webcast. Also, I need to remind everyone, we want to get as many questions as possible from the folk on the call. I have a couple here already. I'm going to wait for maybe 5-10 more minutes. If you have some, type them in the chat box and we'll get to them. To Thibaut and Karen's point, it feels like a lot of this stuff can be done without new rules, new legislation. You can use existing structures, international structures, through the OECD, through the WTO, and therefore, if you want to do something and the will is there, you do not need to wait for, say, Congress or the Commission to do something, no offense, Thibaut, you can really get involved and get stuck in quite quickly.
Is it a question for me or?
Yeah, well, it was more a statement, but yeah, I mean, it feels to me when I talk to people in DC and Brussels about the Tech Council, it's a question of we can do this now. We don't need to wait and create something new. The structures are there. It's more a will versus a way.
Yeah, I mean, I would almost agree with it, but I think that those who are saying that are sometimes those who don't want anything to happen. And if you look at the situation in WTO right now, or in ITU for that matter, it's not that simple. You know, it's not that we have made lots of progress in the past years, to be frank. So I think that the beauty of the transatlantic relationship and joint activities there is that it can provide fantastic leadership. I mean, really, if the EU and the US get together on something, it will happen and people will follow. And I think that this is also what we have in front of us. If you want to rebalance somehow the entry of some countries like China, you know, in Asia, Africa, South America, where, you know, providing support for infrastructure is actually a way to rewrite the rule book for an open internet, you need to be careful. And I think this is where also EU and US can have a big impact. I mean, we have recently launched what we call our digital compass for 2030. You know, it's basically a strategy to charter our efforts in the next decade. We call it the digital decade. And there we also put forward an invitation actually to work with the US to build a coalition of like-minded countries and try to avoid these risks as far as the digital transformation is concerned, that some countries basically fail to adopt a model that is centered on our values, on human benefits, and instead get influenced by other regions that may actually abuse the internet to, on the contrary, control their population and limit their freedom. I think this is a very real threat worldwide. And this is also one area where I think the G7 can pass a very positive message next week, that we stand together in making sure that our values will prevail, because we will make sure that we get together and carry this, this duty around the world.
Tom, that also kind of goes to your point about focusing on the big tech as part of the big problems.
Right. So Thibaut, I mean, Thibaut is spot on. I mean, here we have this incredible technology. You know, you know, Karen and I have a friend by the name of Blair Levin who described the internet as the most powerful and pervasive platform on the planet, in the history of the planet, and that is a fact. And that powerful platform is being used by some non-Western countries to shut down internally and exploit externally. And, you know, at some point in time, thinking democracies, those who stand for the concept of liberal democracy, need to be banding together and saying, no, here are the rules of the road. Here is what we ought to be standing for. And first, let's stand for them collectively. And then let's stand for helping to spread those concepts. You know, we did it throughout the Cold War, but somehow we've fallen back on that.
So I'm going to start opening up some of these questions to folk, and I've got one here from Tyson Barker in Berlin. Tyson asks, and maybe this one is for you, Thibaut. Here's a question around Privacy Shield, which is the 1-year anniversary of the invalidations coming up next month. Where are the member states on this? If the US were able to guarantee legislative action to revise US redress and privacy rights for intelligence purposes, could that be conditioned on changes to GDPR providing greater redress for US citizens within the EU. Is that a possibility in terms of some of the national security questions around Privacy Shield?
Look, I wish it was so simple. I would say the Privacy Shield. We've been struck down twice by the European Court of Justice. I think really we need to get it right now, and it's not just about nuances between some of our member states. I think that we need to make sure that on both sides there is not only mutual understanding, but that we have really a system of guarantees that will be good enough in terms of the legal threshold. So I cannot go into much detail there, but I think that it will be still a complex discussion. And I think that Commissioner Reinders commented recently on discussions that are taking place. I think he was reasonably optimistic, but also realistic that we are not there yet.
I would be remiss to not bring up some of the allegations out this week that said, or alleged at least, that the Danish intelligence services helped the NSA potentially eavesdrop on EU leaders. And so one of the questions here from Johannes kind of is tied to that in terms of, what role does surveillance play? There are some very legitimate concerns and reasons why national security agencies on both sides of the Atlantic should be able to access data, but should there be any type of limitations, or how did the panelists think that if we are trying to reset this digital sort of alliance, how do you deal with the data surveillance question?
Tom, why don't you take that?
Well, I think we got to break it into two parts. First of all, we live in a threatening world, all right, and we need to be cooperating in how we deal with those threats. That's one part of the surveillance question. The other part of the surveillance question is surveillance for profit. And what we can't do, and we can't allow to happen, is that those two infect each other, and it means that you don't get either of them done. So again, back to how do you parse out these issues? And I would just go back again. There is one time that the United States government has stepped up and talked about the privacy rights of individuals using their networks. And that was in a set of privacy rules for networks that we adopted at the FCC in 2016. And 67 days after the Republican Congress came in under Trump, the Congress repealed and the president signed the law repealing those protections. So again, we've got no protections. We've got no policies here. And my understanding of the Privacy Shield is that one of the requirements in the Privacy Shield is that if you are going to avail yourself of the Privacy Shield, there have to be domestic privacy standards yourself. So again, we need to get over that kind of threshold before we can even get to these kind of bigger issues.
I agree with that, Mark. I mean, back to this theme of, I think we're all saying it in different ways, that as I was saying in the beginning, it's not some diplomatic game theory. We're going to trade off one industry against another for the sake of, mutual agreement. We have to get our house in order in a bunch of different ways on both sides of the Atlantic before we can come together and agree on some of these things. This one is really an example of that. But my sense is that everybody knows that on both sides of the Atlantic, they want to solve this, that we need to solve this, and there's huge momentum behind it. So I do subscribe to Digital Bridge, and I do read it all breathlessly, and you should definitely make a plug for how to sign up. But I do have some confidence that we will break through.
Karen has been too kind. If those who don't know, I read a transatlantic weekly tech newsletter called Digital Bridge. So yeah, I will, please sign up if you can do that. It wouldn't be a Transatlantic Tech webinar without the is Europe being protectionist question. So this comes from James. One thing that happened recently is that a European member of parliament called Andreas Schwab came out with some proposals suggesting that only the big 5 US tech companies should sort of fall under the European Commission's new competition policies. Again, Thibaut, I know this is not your area, but as the sort of representative from the Commission, I have to put this to you. How can the Transatlantic Partnership lead the next digital revolution if EU wants to discriminate against US companies? James wants to know.
Okay, I mean, I would like to say that this idea is not the Commission's proposal. We have designed, as part of the DSA and the DMA, some rules that are not discriminatory and that are based on very precise criteria that are linked to policy objectives. So I think that sometimes, you know, this idea that Europe is protectionist, I found almost, I wouldn't say laughable, but not very serious, because if you look at the reality of how open Europe is in terms of public procurement, in terms of trade flows, in terms of welcoming companies from all over the world in our EU-funded programs and so on. I mean, the reality is that Europe is by far the most open continent globally. And I think that the nice way about having national security somehow as a justification, a blanket justification sometimes, also in the US, maybe hiding some measures that if you scrutinize them may look a little bit less only based on security and more based on other types of considerations. So I think that we need to be precise when we use these terms, and I think that really this regulation are trying to address real issues that I think are also faced in the US in terms of how you make sure that online platforms are not creating societal problems somehow because they are not sufficiently behaving in line with the key principles. And I think this is something that everybody can understand. You may approach this from different legal tradition, but I don't think that saying that there is no issue in terms of illegal content, in terms of disinformation, in terms of consumer protection would be a little bit misunderstanding the reality of the online world.
But as we know, the details of how things are written often and therefore how they are discussed often become terribly important. And yes, Thibaut, I totally agree. I think we are in violent agreement about principles, right? Okay. I mean, nobody wants consumer exploitation. Nobody wants market manipulation. Nobody wants lies and hate. And so, you know, in those areas where we're in violent agreement. I mean, I think that the questioner, when he talks about, you know, Andreas Schwab, and I just pulled some of his things that he said last week when he says, quote, "But let's not start with number 7, i.e. I want to focus on these 5. Let's not just go to number 7 to include a European gatekeeper just to please Biden." You know, I understand what he's saying. I understand why that might play well to his constituency. But that attitude is giving argument and ammunition to those who want to portray this as protectionism. And I know you don't speak for him, and I know you can't control him, but I think that's the danger, that the things that we're in violent agreement about can actually get torn apart by substituting protectionism for progress.
As someone who follows this area quite well, I just, for everyone on the call, members of the European Parliament are very important, but they actually do not write the laws. Those come from the Commission, and then there's a whole long, lengthy process that involves member countries, etc. So we are by no means at the end of this process. So there's a long way to go in terms of what's going to happen next. I'm conscious of time, but I also know the 3 of you have sort of worked extensively around the disinformation space. So I just want to get a few of those questions in there last. Thibaut, I'm going to put you on the spot here again as our Commission representative. We had the guidance of the Code of practice on disinformation last week. The Digital Services Act that looks at illegal content is coming. I just wonder, maybe from your perspective, where do you think the EU institutions are going on that? Because it feels that it seems, from my perspective, a little bit of a step change in what you can do with both illegal content and also the difficult sort of gray area, which is disinformation, but not technically illegal content.
Yeah, I will not hide that this is it's a difficult issue, and it's one also that requires very careful attention, because there is a line you don't want to cross. And we were just mentioning earlier that there can be abuse from government online. Something you don't want is to give the impression that freedom of speech somehow is getting a footnote, and the footnote is too big somehow. But I think that I mean, Tom earlier was saying that somehow the EU had a bit of some advance in terms of its thinking, and I think that's how I would answer your question. I think that where we are on disinformation and on illegal content and so on is the result of more than 10 years of trying to get to terms with this problem. And I think we've tried codes of conduct, we've tried voluntary routes. We've reached a stage where we believe that we have also experience enough to put boundary conditions that have a certain degree of robustness, and therefore that can be implemented in situations where we can guarantee that it will not infringe these fundamental rights, but at the same time clearly delineate the content that is not acceptable, if you want. So really, it's not a first attempt. I think it's the result of years of trials and errors and improvements in the way we are approaching this issue.
Karen, maybe I just turn to you to sort of, there's obviously the very important First Amendment in the US. So how would you expect, Congress, maybe going beyond Section 230 reform, could maybe look at some of these issues? Because it feels to me that, even after the November election, disinfo has not gone away in the United States. If not, it's got even more entrenched in political discourse. So how do you see that playing out in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but yesterday there was this huge conspiracy theory flurry about Anthony Fauci, because a bunch of his emails were released through a legal process, and it was almost like a hack of John Podesta's emails, where people were picking and choosing things from the emails, putting them out of context, making him appear to be an apologist for China. It was really quite an illustration that the conspiracy theories are not over. I believe that the free expression issues are strong on both sides of the Atlantic. We have a First Amendment, and there isn't one in Europe, but there's still a human rights value in free expression. And I think Europe is trying to juggle that as well. I tend to be, just as a general rule, pessimistic about legislation getting through, maybe more so now. The pipeline is pretty full for any legislation to get through. I think there are, the agencies have yet to be staffed with permanent staff, but the agencies can do quite a bit. The FTC specifically has a lot of authority to deal with consumer protection. And the Department of Justice can do more to enforce. The way we talk about it is enforce a lot of offline rights and protections in the online environment. And that may necessitate some tweaks to Section 230, that may involve some legislation, and maybe they could be attached to something else, but they don't entail a wholesale throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that moves us in a sort of similar direction to where Europe is. But I think in the meantime, cooperating on this code of conduct, cooperating on getting more transparency and accountability is huge. And there has to be some way through a multilateral mechanism where we can get more transparency, not just in what the platforms are doing in the US and Europe, but how are they enforcing their terms of service around the world, in Myanmar and Somalia, et cetera. There has to be some way we can do that. I was ambassador to the OECD in the Obama administration, and all the countries of the OECD plus some endorsed a recommendation on internet policymaking principles that said, domestically countries can do what they need to do in a variety of areas, but they should make sure they respect international human rights and free flow and et cetera, et cetera. And we haven't done enough that's marching in that direction. I think that's the kind of thing we're talking about. We can do things in a different way, but respecting these basic rights and values. And I think the administration, from an agency perspective, an enforcement perspective, and a multilateral setting, can do quite a lot. But it is, with respecting free expression.
I think Karen's right, but this is where our violent agreement on principles begins to fray, because we have different sets of principles on expression, and we need to make sure that there is not a leakage from marketplace oversight into expression oversight. And I think that there are ways to come together, but this is going to make the competition questions look like kindergarten.
So I am aware we have a couple minutes left, and so I'm going to start with Karen and work my way across. I'm going to give you a magic wand where you can be inside both sort of the EU-US summit coming up, and let's leave aside COVID and climate change and all the very important issues and focus solely on digital. If you were able to get one thing out of the summit coming up in terms of the digital transatlantic relationship, what would you like to see? And Karen, unfortunately, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Oh, thanks a lot. I guess I'm really taken by the last question that we're asked about treating digital less like an economic sector and industrial sector, and more like the kind of platform that Tom was talking about for advancement. And so I feel like I'm going to cheat on your question. I'm going to assume that the tax issue has a lot of momentum and the privacy issue has a lot of momentum, even the disinformation issue. And I say focusing on how digital can be used to solve our big problems, especially in the environment, job creation through emerging tech. And then this questioner, Merck Fox, asks about countering the digital Belt and Road, like really helping countries that are less economically developed and are seeing their economies really hit by COVID. What can we do to help them build out their infrastructure and build out their digital innovation? I think that would be a tremendous positive sum. Let's get away from the zero sum stuff. Let's work on some positive sum goals.
Great, thank you for that. Thibaut, to you.
I think that I really hope that we can indeed launch the creation on this Trade and Technology Council and really have, I would say, 2-3 very concrete goals until the end of the year. I think one of them should be to work together on value chain. And another one also, I would join Karen in saying that indeed this alliance for somehow an open internet or something like this would be a very nice and concrete target if I could decide.
And Tom, the final word to you.
So real fast, you can see why Karen was an ambassador, number one. The way she summed that up and put it together, it's perfect. Digital, don't get trapped in digital. Everything in the 21st century is digital. We're not talking about what are we going to do about digital and let's have a digital policy. We need to focus on what are the effects of digital and prioritize those and go after them. And I think Karen's given us a good outline for that.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I think time is up. I just want to say thank you so much for our panelists, Karen, Thibaut, and Tom, for joining us. And also thank you to those who've joined us on this webinar. I hope you've found it really useful. I know I have. And with that, my name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's Chief Tech Correspondent. And thank you so much for joining us.
And I'm just going to add thanks to Sam DuPont and Eli Weiner for helping as well.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.